Hi, Ben. Good morning. Do you want to start by introducing the Rasa community? Sorry, before the stream we were talking about Kaggle. The Rasa community, and talk a little bit about what it is that you do.
Yeah,
What we
absolutely.
can begin.
So as part of the Rasa community, I work at Rasa and I'm a solutions engineer. I'm in Rasa, and what that means is, day to day, I work with some of our enterprise customers really to help them build their bots, help them deploy their bots, help them fix bugs, and really just helping companies, build Rasa bots and get them to production. And that's sort of what I do day to day.
Get a chance to work on a lot of big, complicated projects. Uh, get the get the gnarly bug.
Yeah, definitely get a lot of interesting bugs and a lot of head scratchers. I would say that's part of the job, and what I spend a lot of my time just thinking about interesting problems and trying to fix bugs and talking to our engineering team and really just kind of being that channel between our customers and our backend engineers who actually work on Rust open source and Rust X.
So just to kick off, I'm curious, what is in kind of vague terms. I don't want you to reveal it proprietary information. But what would you say is the most common type of problem people running into starting to put a bot into production?
Sure. I would say on the Rust open source end, a lot of it is just kind of getting used to stories. A lot of companies
Mm.
are kind of coming from, some of our competitors are coming from different types of assistants that are maybe state machines or, haven't really been exposed to machine learning for the dialogue management aspect. So there tends to be kind of an adjustment, just getting used to the idea that, stories are training data and, you have to build out your set, you have to really validate it, and you have to treat it in the same way that you would kind of build out your NLU data. And that kind of tends to be kind of a like a wrap your head around moment for a lot of our customers just getting started in the process.
Yeah. Have you found, I don't know how many folks you're working with are using, I know yet, but have you found that the inclusion of, I guess, separation of rules has made that process or hard?
I think, sort of just as customers are moving to 2.0, it's a little bit of a shift for them just because it's kind of a new concept for them to get used to. But as far as like implementation and just working with them, having rules does make things a lot simpler for them since they can kind of, certain things they can say, we don't want to let machine learning handle this. We can just build a rule and kind of not worry about it. So I would say it tends to make their lives easier once they kind of get used to what rules are and kind of what they mean in the context of RASA.
You're waiting for up the forum, and we get some forum questions. And while I'm doing that, if you would like, talk a little about um, your background, how you got into conversation. Maybe I thought I always like to ask that question. Any kind of
Yeah,
things that you want.
yeah, I'd love to. So a little bit about just how I got into, I think, conversational AI and NLU. So I spent, some time as a graduate student, studying machine learning, focused on computer vision, and that was kind of where I was interested in, mostly earlier in my career. And then, I started working at Disney, and I worked there for about 3 years. Initially, as a computer vision engineer, but for me, whenever I had the chance to work on NLU and kind of work on any kind of interactive voice assistant, that's what really kind of caught my eye, and I felt
Mhm.
like it was something I was really interested in. And I felt like as a field, NLU was really growing, and there's really a lot of potential as far as some of the work that the research community is doing, and having that translate into something enterprise or product ready. So at Disney, that's kind of where I got exposed to NLU. Working at some of the major platforms, like you probably know of Amazon Lex and Dialogflow and tools like that. And then, while working at Disney, I kind of got digging around and, looking and exploring the NLU space. And that's how I heard about Rasa. And then, I guess the rest is history after I joined.
You about
Yeah, a little over 6 months so far.
Ganesh says,
Hey,
"Welcome
Ganesh.
to the stream." Okay, so I have a question about an bot. So let's see it. So this is just forum. My team is currently developing an FAQ bot for a company. I've read the whole documentation. A plus. That's a great start. And many forum topics, but some things are still not clear to me. We have around 70 questions, each one with their particular answer. Many questions related to the same user intent, but for different entities. For example, intent, password. I want to change my company platform password. So there's different questions, different entities referring to different types of password that the user change. We're having some trouble trying to retrieve the correct response from the bot, as well as even making it understand the correct. That makes sense to me. It sounds like these things are they're going to be a little bit harder for the machine. The actual structure, an example, there are many. And then they have synonyms for change, alter, modify, set, and query assistant conversation starts. Says something. Sorry, the user says hi. The assistant says something. The user says, "Hey, I want to change my password." Extract the entity. And then the response are and the are what's the best way to implement this? Elements and should we structure in the
So the way that this was done was actually correct. So if you wanted to kind of, based on separating the response based on the entity that's extracted for the same intent, this is the right way to do it, and your stories look great. I think the only change that would have to go here would be to make that slot a categorical slot, which lets you basically condition on that in your stories. So you can say, this platform entity, which will get sorted as a slot, can take n number of values, and you can predefine them, and then you can in your stories define for each of the particular n values what should happen in the story, and then the dialog manager will pick up on that when it's trained. So I think just converting or creating a slot for platform and then making it categorical will make this story work.
Also wondering if maybe it makes sense rules, and this is something that I'm still sort of figuring out is when the best place to use a rule. But if like identify they want to change their password, you identify the platform they want to change the password on, you want to make sure that you always have the next action be okay.
Yeah, I think just working with customers, with rules, I always kind of err a little bit on the cautious side when kind of suggesting rules, since they're very rigid. So unless they know absolutely that this is kind of going to be the case, even as they build out their bot, I would recommend just keeping it as a story, just the way it is. And then if as you build the bot and you determine that this always happens and there's never any additional follow-ups that are context dependent, then you can definitely make this a rule. But I think just keeping it as a story to start would make sense.
So start with stories, get as far as you can, and then if you need to switch.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a about audio. My audio will be a little bit unstable from my video in a way that I can't fix because of the way that I'm doing things. Sorry about that. All right, and we have some questions in the chat. So let's go to the chat. Starting with, sorry if I'm saying this correctly, I have a problem with misspelled user inputs. I checked the Rasa forum and there's not so much information. Some developers mention SimSpellPy, which is a Python library, but there is no implementation or any sample. As an example, when the user input is what are the dependencies for task 24, there's no problem when the production is good. But when the user input is what are the dependencies for task 64, with just a single letter of dependencies missing, the prediction is NLU fallback, threshold is 0.4, so quite a low threshold. So how to deal with
Okay, So it sounds like the misspelling in that example was task 24 versus 64. Was that right?
Oh, so it was dependencies.
Okay, dependency was misspelled. So the first thing to try would be to add a character level featureizer into your NLU pipeline. And what that does is it just gives another kind of input feature for the intent classifier to use, and this time at the character level, so it helps kind of project out some of that noise that comes with misspellings.
Yeah, so instead of sort of walking across words, you walk across like smaller units to be able to.
Exactly.
So let's try. Another question from Fiza. Hi, Fiza. Can you give me a brief explanation on Rasa pipelines and policies? I'm using a supervised embedding. The tokenizers and supervisors, how are they built? Using what algorithm? And what algorithm build the policy?
So pipelines are strictly for like Rasa NLU. So the pipeline will define, your all the components that make up your NLU pipeline. So the tokenizers, the word embeddings, the featureizers, as well as the intent classifiers and the entity extractors. So that's what the pipeline defines in your configuration file, and then the policy defines, like you kind of alluded to, the underlying algorithms, but this time for the dialog manager. So it determines how the dialog manager sort of makes decisions based on the current context of the conversation. It figures out what the bot should say or do next. And as far as I think just talking about like the input, supervised word embeddings and some of the algorithms you had talked about related to NLU. So with Rasa, we have a lot of flexibility with what sort of word embeddings and models you'd like to use. And we generally recommend starting with kind of one of the more simpler featureizers, I believe being the count vectors, which is just compiling the words and doing counts on each of the input word features. But you do have the option, like in the example that's here, to use excuse me, one of the pre-trained spacey word embedding models, or even like you had mentioned, if you have an existing supervised word embedding, you can plug that in as well. Or if you'd like to use BERT or any of kind of the more complex embeddings, that's also available.
Another part of this, each of them. So I would dig a bit more. Well, I guess it depends a little bit on what you mean. So if you mean which of them are trained, where the model is updated over time, even if it's not, when you're training the pipeline, but when it was originally created, I believe a lot of the space ones, regex is rule-based. Count vectors are counting things, and I think lexical syntax.
Yeah, it's rule based and it's based on like part of speech. So it'll look at like the relative position of words, but yeah, that's also rule based.
And then diet is machine learning, and Vincent has a great series of videos on that on all that goes much more in depth about the model. It's sort of the one we generally developed it very fancy, and it's multitask learning, doing entity extraction and identification, also a little masked language modeling. Hopefully that helps. Other add about the
no, but I did. Oh, I think there was part of the question was about the underlying algorithms of the policies.
yes.
So in your policies, with Rasa, we kind of separate it as you have rule-based policies and you have machine learning-based policies. So for the rule-based policies, as you'd imagine, it's very kind of deterministic. They're kind of hard-coded in that sense. But for the machine learning policies, it's using an LSTM under the hood, and that's built on top of TensorFlow for kind of modeling, the states of the dialogue manager, and using that to kind of make predictions based on kind of input features from the NLU pipeline and from kind of the historical context of the conversation.
And the Keras policy in particular. So TED is a transform.
I believe TED is LSTM plus like an attention mechanism, right? That's what I.
watch Vincent's video.
Yeah.
He's gone into much more depth about it. It's the algorithm whiteboard. I think I'm in the wrong place. Docs to. Hopefully that helps find it. So, Ganesh wants to know, are there a baseline set of checks on GitHub you would recommend when you try to push a new set of annotated training examples Rasa X?
Yes, and I would recommend taking a look at some of our example pipelines that are attached to GitHub. And what they do is essentially run um, kind of two things to validate, updates to training data. The first, excuse me, would be cross validation on your NLU model. So it's taking your existing training data and kind of chunking it up into n groups, training on the majority, and then testing on the minority, and doing that in kind of a combinatorial fashion. And that's a good way of just testing whether the NLU data you've added is really improving the model. And then also running Rasa tests. So this is kind of testing your stories in your dialog manager to make sure that in your test data, as you push updates, that nothing is breaking and things are still working correctly. So I would say, yeah, running cross validation on your NLU, and then doing story testing as well are always two really good sanity checks before you deploy your model to Rasa X.
Like, you can do the new GitHub action Rasa X, but I haven't done it yet.
Yes, you can. So that actually went live yesterday, and we're in the process of updating some of our starter pack examples to include this action. But yes, so this new GitHub action, if you include in your CI pipeline, can do all the steps I just talked about. So it'll perform the cross validation for you. It'll do the model testing for you, and you can configure it to automatically post the results as a comment to the PR, which I find is really helpful too.
So automate. use our thing we built. Additional questions, and they're coming thick and fast now. Oh, Ganesh has another question. If you're using an NLU-only bot, should you have stories with just action as a response to each utterance/intent, or do you leave it empty? Pros, cons for each.
You can leave it totally empty. So if you're doing an NLU-only bot and you just want to hit the endpoint or hit the API and kind of get that NLU parse results, you don't need any stories there, and it'll run perfectly.
And I think if you don't include any stories, try to train.
Yeah, it'll generate like an NLU-only model.
If you add stories, you might end up spending time training. And says, what kind of Rasa to develop the diet classifier? It's complex, a lot of them, but sort of the core of it is that there's a transformer model doing this multitasking. And I would check out Vincent's video. He goes into it. Houston, so sorry, I shouldn't, was the one who asked about the spelling detection. So as you'll agree, putting all combinations of letter for 100. Oh, no, definitely don't try to do that. There are some spell checker packages for Python that can be applied on text. I'm able to try them in regular Python scripts. I spend my hours and days, but couldn't find a way to apply in the Rasa pipeline. And I think that's the point. With the help of the Rasa team spell checking, can't manage spell checking problems for all combinations sentences. And this may have been written before we talked about the character-based model for a bit. I would avoid, if possible, doing spell checking past your text, the NLP pipeline, or NLU pipeline, sorry. Yeah, do you want to talk?
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. It's always a better idea to use the input features itself that it's generating. In this case, like we kind of talked about, adding in a character level featureizer, since that does help you account for those hundreds or even thousands of possible variations in the way that people can kind of misspell things. And then with that character level featureizer, adjusting what's called a min grant min n-gram and max n-gram. So this adjusts kind of the character analysis size that it's looking at, and kind of playing with that tends to be quite helpful too.
There we go.
Yeah, there it is.
So would want perhaps by two, but yeah, you shouldn't need to find all your possible mistakes. One thing I will say is have like a product name that is often misspelled, and what you finding a synonym. You're like, hey, if you spelled this way, it's actually the same as this other thing. Really, if you're trying to extract it, that could be. But I wouldn't do that for everything. Unnecessary. I agree. Yeah, Ganesh has some more questions about misspellings, which is great. This is something that comes up a lot on. Should you train your model based on raw production input, which can include misspellings, or should you perform some kind of data massaging to correct spellings before training? Note that the misspellings can be common or uncommon, but will remain.
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I do get this a lot. And I would say training just on the raw input text data is always a good idea, since it's very representative of the ways that users interact with your bot, and it will help it really tune to the ways that people type things when they're interacting with it. So definitely, I would say avoid trying to scrape or kind of tune any of the data that's actually coming back from your users, and focus on analyzing and understanding that real data set, and using that for training would be a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a strong, I don't know, particularly if you've had a lot of like second language training, there's definitely a strong, like as a human being learning to speak another or use another language, there's definitely like this strong trust and like being towards standard, and like there's a correct way to do it. As it turns out, that's not necessarily always very representative actually do things. And if you build on the assumption that people are always going to like very type of writing in interacting with your assistant, they might, and if that's what they're actually doing, then yeah, keep doing that. But if they're not, and they're sort of using terms of informal conversations in text, maybe pretty common, then trying to train a model that can only handle text is not going to work as. I understand the impulse, but it probably won't.
Yeah, unfortunately, the bad part with bots and really just freeform text is your users can type anything. So really, just being able to account for that sort of anything is always a good idea.
Yeah. The joy and the challenge.
Yeah.
Arnie has a question that I don't know the answer. How can you change the voice from male to female in the React-based chat room component? You may know this off the top of your head, but I will say this is not a Rasa project. This is a project.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, which library you're using? Is it the botprint one, or if you could point us to that, we might be able to just take a look real quick. But yeah, like Rachel has said, that's not something we officially support, and this kind of a the scalable mind.
Yeah, this one. I did do a video on it a while ago, so I have done content around it, but and I might ask, maybe file an issue. All right, Bobbin has a question. Connect a live.
Okay, so connecting a live agent to Rasa, or connecting a user to a live agent through Rasa.
Based on the way the question is phrased, and let me know if I'm wrong about this, Robin. My guess is that if someone is talking to and you want to get human, how can you do that so that your user is talking to a human agent instead of your
Yeah, yeah, this is a great question, and definitely a question that a lot of people have as far as how to handle, this human handoff. So the first thing that you do is create an intent, to capture this. Probably call it something like human handoff, and in your NLU data, just training on all the cases when your users are asking to just talk to an agent, and just creating that intent. And then you would create a rule that essentially triggered. You're providing some sort of specific kind of triggering message back from Rasa. And I would say the key here, just from a kind of
it looks like Ben has so
okay,
right after you said the key.
okay, yeah. So the key here is really to create or really design like an orchestration layer that sits in between your users and Rasa, and this kind of layer will kind of handle the multiplexing. So it'll determine, based on the conditions that you set with the human handoff intent, when it needs to switch over from, talking to Rasa and making requests to Rasa to your kind of live agent channel or your live agent API. So it would be, creating this human handoff intent, um, having Rasa respond with kind of a trigger message to tell this intermediate orchestration layer to switch from sending messages to Rasa to a human handoff channel or your live agent, and then using that to kind of give messages back to the users from your live agent.
And what sort of tool to use to build the orchestration layer?
It really depends. I've seen something as simple as, in many cases, like a microservice, like say AWS Lambda, and just using that to kind of handle the switch off with the requests. But in some cases, at large scale, that's when people start thinking about creating servers or even clusters in the orchestration layer. But that tends to be for handling thousands and hundreds of thousands of incoming conversations. So I would say starting as simple as a microservice would be a good idea there.
So hope that helps. So apparently my audio is having some trouble. Uh, I will do my best, but I'm doing the audio through, so I'm a little bit limited in what I can do. Apologies. All right. Questions. Oh, I'm sorry, Aryan. I skipped one of yours. How to send data from Rasa input to Django?
Django, I mean, that would probably be done, I'd say through a custom action, and that's where you can, interact with any kind of backend code and make any, write any custom code and have Rasa interact with that directly. So taking a look at, our Rasa SDK, and I think we have some documentation on custom actions would be a good starting point there.
This up, and I have actually I think I'm in the wrong part of the docs to get SDK. I'm in the
Yes. Oh yeah. Yes, we did move the Rasa action server documentation out. Yeah. Right here.
and I do have a YouTube tutorial. Hopefully my audio is a little bit better here. I believe Zoom is doing some pre-processing I didn't ask for, and it's causing me issues. Anyway, what was I going to say? I was saying something. I got distracted. There's a video tutorial I did on Django and the chat room app that we were just talking about, and Rasa in a very basic way. Yeah. Anyway, the Rasa SDK docs are in the No one can see this. We're not looking at the browser. Sorry, the Rasa SDK is in the Rasa Action Server docs now. My apologies. Messing with the audio. All right, so we have another question. When tracking production conversations in Rasa X, is it possible to also get insight into intent/entities injected through the trigger intent API? Because how the conversation proceeds is affected.
Yes, and I might need to double check on this, but I'm pretty sure if you inject it through the API, it gets stored in the tracker, and then because this message is in the tracker, it does appear in Rasa X in the conversations that you review.
I don't know that I'm gonna be able to fix the audio, is what that face was. Sorry about that. Yes, so hopefully that answers your question. Dinesh says, can we initiate the welcome message from Rasa before the user-initiated message in Facebook Messenger?
Yes, so the way to do that in Facebook Messenger is you can define that initial payload. So when they kind of interact with that assistant, they will have to click a button to kind of start the conversation. And in Facebook Messenger, you can define what that payload is. And then in your stories, you would create sort of a story for mapping that initial, get started payload or intent, and kind of have Rasa utter that initial message before the user actually says anything. Yes, you can do that.
And another question from Dinesh, who asked about Facebook Messenger. Can we connect Rasa streaming with Kafka? Is it possible to integrate with AWS Kinesis Stream or AWS Firehose?
Sure. So I'm not, super familiar with those with AWS Kinesis and how that works, but to answer your question about Kafka, yes. With Rasa Open Source, you can connect an event broker. And we have two options, Kafka or RabbitMQ. And what this does is it will stream all the events that also get stored in the tracker. So, all user messages, all bot messages, all actions and events, and all slots. And all these events get sent across your Kafka stream, and you can use that sort of downstream, whether it be in your dashboards or kind of daily like archiving. But that is configurable.
Thank you. And let me know if this audio is any better. I've changed some stuff. Hopefully that answers your question, Dinesh. Sounds like you're building something exciting. Senol, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, says, I'm trying to write custom component for spell checking to use in pipeline. Another spell checking question. In the process function, I can get the user message.get text, then perform necessary corrections. But I couldn't handle to assign the corrected messages to the message variable. In the forum, I was suggested to use message.set method, but there was no further explanation. Can you please explain how to use that method, message.set?
So I think I would go back to our first recommendation about trying a character level featureizer and just testing that out and seeing if that kind of solves the spell checking problem with your NLU pipeline. And as far as I think was it message.set is what they're referring to, or
yeah, it sounds right.
Do you know where they kind of mentioned where this is fitting into their pipeline, or sort of what's calling this?
So they're getting the user message using message.get, and then they want to hand it back to the assistant.
Okay, message.set. Yeah, so normally, I would say definitely start with what we kind of just touched on with, doing a character level featureizer. But if you're looking for just how to, at a high level, implement like a spell checker, that would be normally done as a custom component in your pipeline and not through the SDK or any of the actions. I believe we have a blog post that kind of walks through the steps to build a custom component in your NLU pipeline. So I would refer to that. I think it was used as blog post, and it might have been from a little bit ago, but
Oh, my internet's slow. I love that. Yep. Enhancing Rasa NLU models with custom components. I wanted to add something like a spell checker might be. But in general, I mean, one of the benefits of a machine learning approach that's a little bit fuzzier over something like a state machine or rule-based machine is that you can handle things in a more flexible way. So ideally, you don't need to build a spell checker as long as the types of spelling errors you get fall into sort of like characters are deleted, characters are inserted, one character substituted, two characters are switched, that sort of error. You should be able to get a lot of those with a character level model. If it's like an I spelling, so if things are misspelled the way that a small child would misspell things, probably not going to help. But if things are misspelled in the way that someone typing quickly would misspell things, probably will help. Signal says, I couldn't find any explanation for message.set methods in the docs either.
Message.set.
Yeah. It probably is going to be something that updates the tracker, right?
That's what it sounds like, but I will say it's not something that I've come across very frequently.
This could also be part of the legacy SDK that is no longer available. Could be something that's happened there.
Yeah, it doesn't sound. I guess if this person could, I guess, maybe follow up with like what version of Rasa they're using and sort of where they're using message.set in their bot, that'd be helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you have any other additional information, that would be great. John asks, in relation to Dinesh's question about the initial payloads, so saying hi before your conversation starts, can it also be done in Rasa X or the shell?
Was that a question? If that can be done in Rasa X or the shell? So no. So there's no, in Rasa X or the shell, there's no official support for kind of like setting that initial payload. That's something that's tied to your custom channel. In this case, Facebook Messenger would be handling setting that initial payload. But what you can do is you can use an intent trigger to kind of mimic that initial payload. And what you do is you would type / and then the intent name, and that would, from Rasa's perspective, immediately trigger a particular intent and then kind of go along that story you defined and kind of bypass the NLU model, at least for that initial payload.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps. You can also, I believe, if you're sharing your assistant using Rasa X, there's a little place where you can add some text that people will see when they open the assistant. So that could be a place where you could be like, hi, welcome to my assistant that I'm sharing with you. Say hi to, I don't know, whatever you call your assistant. Assisty. To get the conversation going. Aryan says, how to get the latest user input for Rasa. If I'm using this message.tracker.latestmessage.text, I'm having a problem with NLU fallback.
Yeah, I mean, pulling it from the tracker would be is the right way to do it. And I guess my question would be, what issue are you seeing with NLU fallback? Is that appearing as the intent, or can you talk about what the problem is there?
Yeah, and you would, NLU fallback is an intent that will be assigned automatically if the sort of categorization of what the intent is falls below the threshold that you set in your pipeline. So if you're like, I did create an intent called NLU fallback, we did it for you. Jefferson says, how would you go about connecting the front end iOS/Swift to a Rasa agent and to send a session ID generated by Swift to Rasa? I've never worked with iOS.
I have, but it's been a little bit, and I would say it would be very similar to connecting it from really any other front end system. You would do it either through making a REST call, so using our REST input channel, or using a socket IO. So it depends on sort of what connection you want there. It can be either through WebSockets or through REST. And then you can pass in the session ID, which I'm guessing is kind of unique to each sender, just as an input JSON message. So you, for the REST input, use the sender field and then pass in that ID. And then the conversation would be unique for that session ID that you're sending to Rasa.
And then we have sort of more details on how to do the REST connecting under custom connectors in our doc. So hopefully that helps. So more information on the how to get user message and custom component, the forum link. Gonna be a little bit rough for me to get up, but I will do my darndest. And Dinesh wants to know how Rasa will support multi-language. What steps should we follow for non-English language? Oh, I do have a sort of general answer to multilingual stuff. The answer is that it's hard, but I have a video on the Rasa YouTube channel called Multilingual NLP, part of the NLP for Developers, where I go into some of the different approaches that you might take and sort of their benefits and drawbacks, which have been and also.
Yeah, definitely.
This link up.
Yeah, and I think the video covers it. But the sort of two approaches would be first thinking about from the dialogue manager's perspective, right? Are your stories different for the different languages? And in the case that they aren't, what you could do is just separate out your NLU model from your dialogue manager and just train, NLU models specific for each language, and host them in that way and have them attached to the same dialogue manager endpoint. But in the case that your stories might differ, for the multilingual bots, you would have to train each model individually per language.
And it's obviously much more complex in the situation where you have people who are using multiple languages together. And at that point, you're probably going to have to build a custom for your particular. And we do have. I'll pop this in. It. The message dot set.
Let's see. Just scroll up to the original, to the first post. I just want to see what's sort of going on. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so this is a custom component. Okay. Main and then process. Okay. Yeah, my first thought would be to kind of refer to that blog post that you still had, since that should go through sort of what needs to go inside a custom component for that to work.
Sample code. So this is getting the raw text message ready to go into the NLP pipeline. Yeah, and message.set, it looks like, is the method that she's and message is coming from. Okay, so it's a method on the message itself, looks like. Yeah. I'm not finding this in the docs. I'm wondering if this is not available in 2.0.
Oh, if it's been deprecated, let me see. Message.set.
Ben's gonna poke into that a little bit. And Aryan says, can you help me to get the latest user input from Rasa? So in the tracker, the current state of the tracker is, everything that's happened previously in the conversation, and I believe you get it as a JSON, so you can go through and I would honestly recommend just like uh, looking at it. So if you're working with a copy of a tracker for testing purposes, opening it up and then looking at the specific path you'd need for a particular piece of information. What I was trying to say there. John says, thanks, John. And John says, I tried to customize action session start based on the docs. I tried to append a new event, but it is not happening. Or I tried using the dispatcher, but it's also not working. Is there something wrong? Hard to say without seeing the code.
Yeah, so my first question would be whether you have action session start listed in your domain file, since if you're using a custom one, you'll have to put that there. And that would be sort of the first thing to check.
Yeah, and you also need to have the action server running, right?
Yes, that's a good point as well. Yes, so you'll need to run the action server in a separate terminal window when you start up Rasa.
So if you are doing those things, let us know, and then we'll see if we can help you with anything. Regenerex, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, says, I'm sending messages from a custom front end via Socket.io to Rasa, and only Socket.io connection logs are being displayed in the terminal where Rasa is running. Is there a way to get more debug info? I think there's a tag when you start the Rasa server.
Yeah, it should be Rasa run, and then the flag would be -- debug, and that'll kind of give you a lot more information as to what's going on under the hood as Rasa's run.
Sorry, I'm banning some. Yeah, so --debug when you start your server. Oh, John didn't add it in the domain. Great, we're glad we could solve it for you. Hopefully solve it. Aryan says, how can we train a large amount of data in Rasa? I'm guessing you have like a lot of NLU sample data or a lot of stories.
So I guess my question would be whether this data has been kind of parsed and you've gone through and made sure that they're labeled correctly and they're properly classified before you train. And if they are, then you can just kind of run the standard Rasa train, and it works well on pretty large data sets. And I guess just speaking to large data sets, a lot of times people will want to train on like a GPU, since that does cut down on training time. If you're training on a large data set as well.
And then there's that section on the docs as well for using a GPU that you can try out if you have access to it. Right. Sinnel says, Rasa 2.0, I'm trying to quit a form in the middle and have several unhappy stories for that. In the debug mode, I can see that the bot predicts the stop intent, but it still continues to ask for the next slot. What might be the reason for that?
Still asks for the next slot. Actually, could you repeat the question again?
So there's a form, they want to interrupt it in the middle. The stop form intent is being correctly identified, but this form is continuing to be looped through.
Yes. So what you'll have to do is create another story or rule. So in this case, this is where rules work really well. And this rule will define when the user is kind of in the middle of a form, what needs to happen from the bot's perspective. So what you could do is create a rule that essentially checks if the user is currently in that form, and the user kind of types in that stop intent or that stop message, having it just deactivate the form. But you'll have to create a separate rule for that. I'd like to say we have something in our docs page under conversation patterns on that, but
Oh, wait.
It should be for, yes, handling unexpected input. We have. Okay, so this is a way to do it through stories, but see, we have an example of that happening rules as well. And let me find the example, and we can share that link with you as well.
Yeah. So for generic introductions, define rules. Actions, like someone says stop the form, and you stop the form.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Ash asks, for developing multi-language, suppose we want to develop a model for 3 languages. We need to install 3 instances of Rasa, or can we configure this into one model?
I mean, it sounds to me like they would need 3 separate models, but what do you think?
I mean, it depends. So I would say a big limiting factor is the degree to which the pipelines can overlap. So if you have, your languages are all written with the same alphabet, in the same direction, have the sort of same way of delineating words, and you have a lot of examples for your training data, you might be able to train your own model that can handle all 3 of those languages together. You're probably going to have to do your own, train your own representations that you can use for this sort of multilingual model, and then push it through the rest of the NLU pipeline. That's going to require a lot of sort of futzing. It's the likelihood that you will find a multilingual model out of the box for the specific 3 languages that you're working with pretty low. And if you are using a separate language model for each, well, not just a language model, but a separate NLU pipeline for each, then yes, they do need to be running on separate instances of Rasa currently. You might get lucky. You might find some representations that include data from the 3 languages that you're looking for in the same model. And if you do, then
Right. So I just put a link to the in the Zoom chat. If you could open that up, Rachel, and we can. I can just kind of quickly talk through that question about handling, I think, that stop intent in the context of a form. So it would be a little bit of a modification from this rule, but essentially, right, you would use lines 11 and 12. You would define a rule that's conditioned on a form being active.
Wait, 1 sec. Sorry, no one can see the browser. That's on me. There we go.
Okay, cool. Cool.
Here's the rule.
Yes. So the rule. So this, the rule would be a little bit different based on what you kind of talked about. But what you would do is create a separate rule and use lines 11 and 12 in that rule. And what that does is it tells the dialog manager that this rule only applies when the user is in the middle of a particular form, in this case, the newsletter form. And in this case, what would have to change is you would move line 14 down, and you'd create a new case where it's dash an intent, and the intent, I think, would be the stop intent. And then after that, you would have you would include lines 14 and 15 depending on if needed. But essentially, line 14 would tell the dialog manager that under these conditions, let's deactivate the form, and then we can kind of figure out what to do next.
And then any other actions or utterances that you want to have after that, utterances or actions.
Exactly.
So hopefully that helps. The problem that I have is I forget to set the loop to null, and then I do other things, but the form's still going, so the form happens first. So
yeah, we'll say writing stories is always it can get a little tricky just because it's sometimes hard to keep track of everything, which is why I would say maybe just using the interactive learning tool to write stories is can also be helpful.
And that's in Rasa X. Is that? Yes. Can you get it in the shell?
Yes, if you just do Rasa and then interactive, that'll kick it off as well.
I think I've ever used it in the shell. I've never used it in Rasa X. Right. Another question from John. Would adding a language classifier on the pipeline help in handling multi-language Rasa chatbot? And in that case, one would have that language classifier then run separately. So, I mean, yes, in theory. The big problem, so the task of identifying that the language that a text is written in is called language identification or language ID, or sometimes ling ID. And the big problem with that as a task is that it works better the more data you have. So for conversation turns, for very short user-generated data, things like tweets, it is very difficult to get accurate language identification with the sort of turn length that you get in a usual conversational interaction. You can do it. You are likely to run into pretty serious bugs. And I mean, not even like bugs, but pretty serious problems with machine learning where the wrong language is being identified. So I think my default approach here, if I had to build a multilingual assistant, is I would start by having a button that people press for the language they want, or I would sort of deduce which model to serve them based on the language they're using the website in or something. And then they would get just the model that I thought was best for them, rather than trying to do it at a turn level. You can. It's just going to be very difficult, and you're going to run into a lot of errors. That will be fun. Do you have anything to add there, Ben?
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. I would say, trying to stay away from using a language ID model for that, since you have to account for when it does go wrong, and that, it can get very complicated. So yeah, putting a button or some kind of configurable parameter is always a good idea there.
Regenerex says, so this is a question about getting the logs from the socket.io server. I'm running with the debug, enable API, and cores option in the command line, and I only get the information about the socket logs. I have no session persistence. So sending messages should display something, question mark?
Yeah, so I guess if we could go back to the docs page. So my question would be sort of how you're making requests to the socket.io, because there are some parameters. So if you click on your own website a little bit, perfect, and then to the WebSocket channel.
It's in the shortcut, I don't have to scroll.
Yeah, so there are some configurations that you can make to your socket.io channel so that the session does persist, and you can pass in that session ID, and it'll persist for the lifespan of that WebSocket being open. So I would double check that, and making sure that these are configured properly, and also that your front end is passing in a session ID. Since if you're setting session persistence to true, you'll have to pass in an ID, and that's how Rasa figures out what message is tied to which session.
And then if we wanted to see like the sort of the tracker state and what's happening at every stage of the conversation from the Rasa server, and that's not showing up, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it should be with the debug flag. So you should, what's supposed to happen is it'll show all the messages that are coming in from the user, all that NLU information, all the information on the dialog state as well. So I would ask, double check if this session persistence is correctly configured, because if it is, then all that information should be there in the server logs.
Yeah, and if it's still not doing it for you, I might file a bug on the Rasa HQ GitHub is what I was looking for. I think it's time for another coffee for me. And I think this will probably be our last question because we're just at time. Ganesh wants to know, when tracking production conversations in Rasa X, is it possible to also get insight into intents/entities injected through the trigger intent API, because how the conversation proceeds is affected?
So yes, so if you use the trigger API, it'll inject that message into the tracker, and that'll appear in the context of your conversation in Rasa X. And I guess my question would be whether, when you're kind of tracking this injection, does it have to be, are you interested in tracking it just in the context of the message that's coming in, or do you actually want to track when this trigger API is being called?
I think there's going to be a little bit of that, and meanwhile, share this because we got that. So I'm going to take a little bit to actually I am working on it, Chanel. Take a look. I have a on follow back from Ganesh. John says, first time here in the live Q&A. Thanks for answering questions. I learned a lot from the other questions. Oh, good. I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, thanks
okay,
for
and
joining.
Ganesh says, in response to your request for more information, both how and when the API is called, and what are the objects passed into it?
So I will need to double check. If we can pull up the HTTP API documentation, that kind of goes into what that call looks like, and sort of what the event gets injected to the tracker as well. I think you can just walk through that. Okay. Yes, Rasa Open Source, and I think if you just scroll down all the way to the bottom,
the
APIs, should be APIs, and then there we go, HTTP. Oh, the API spec. That would be it. Mm-hmm. Cool. Should be tracker, and then inject an intent into a conversation. Mm-hmm.
Was there
if you scroll down, there should be an example of what that request would look like. Yes, there we go. Yes.
I don't know if I can make that any bigger. Okay, just a tiny bit. Oh, did you want the response samples? Sorry.
Yeah, that works too. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yes. So this is the actual payload that gets injected, and yeah, it's all described here in the API docs.
Have all that information. All right, and I think we're gonna have to wrap it up here because we're right at time. I don't know, it's very busy, so I'm wondering if I don't too off the rails. And if you had any other questions, feel free to bring them to the forum. Carl should just be popping up right now. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining. I hope you found this helpful and educational. Thank you for joining again. Extremely helpful. Content announcements. We have a paper reading group tomorrow. We're going to be looking at some design suggestions for an assistant that works with software engineers to sort of like nudge them to make good decisions. And then starting Friday, there's going to be a live streaming break, and I won't be back until January 14th. So we've got holidays and then some company-wide stuff. So that will be the next office hours. A little bit of a break, but if you have questions in the meantime, forums. Thank you all so much for joining. And have a great rest of your year in 2021.